Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. I was 15 when it happened, and even now, years later, it still sits heavy in my mind in a way that doesn't really match how short it actually was. It didn't last long at all, maybe just a few minutes from beginning to end, but it changed something in me. It changed the way I think about being outside at night, the way I look at people, and the way I listen to that quiet feeling inside me when something doesn't feel right. At that age, you think you understand enough about the world to move through it on your own. You think you can handle yourself. But you don't really understand how quickly things can turn until they actually do. It was around 9 at night, not too late, but late enough that the atmosphere had shifted from daytime normal to something a little quieter, a little less predictable. I was in the downtown area of my city with a friend. The streets weren't empty, but they weren't busy either. There were people around passing by, going about their own business, but not enough that you felt completely surrounded or safe just because of the crowd. It was that in-between kind of setting where everything looks normal, but there's a quiet underneath it that makes certain things stand out more. The lights from the street lamps and nearby shops created this uneven glow across the sidewalks. Some areas were brighter, while others felt slightly dim, even though nothing was completely dark. You could hear distant traffic, occasional voices, the kind of background noise that makes a city feel alive but not overwhelming. At the time, it didn't feel dangerous. It just felt like another night out. Another small adventure that came with being a teenager. I was with a friend I'll call John. He was about 17, a couple of years older than me, and at the time that felt like a big difference. He carried himself like he knew more about the world, like he had more experience. He smoked constantly, almost like it was something he needed to do every few minutes. If he went too long without a cigarette, he would start getting restless, like something was missing. He also drank, which at that age made him seem older, more confident, like he had things figured out in a way I didn't yet. Looking back now, none of that actually made him more prepared for what happened that night. We didn't really have a plan. We were just walking around, passing time, looking for something to do. That was normal for us at that age. Being out at night felt exciting in a simple way. You didn't need a reason. Just being outside, away from home, felt like freedom. Every street felt like it held some kind of possibility, even if most of the time nothing actually happened. We were talking about random things, not really paying attention to where we were going. The conversation wasn't important. It was just background noise to the feeling of being out there together. Everything felt easy, relaxed, like nothing could really go wrong. At some point, we came across a couple of men sitting along the street. They were clearly homeless, sitting near a building with their belongings gathered around them. That wasn't unusual for that area. Downtown always had people like that, sitting on sidewalks, near doorways, sometimes talking, sometimes just watching people pass by. Now, most of the time, you just walk past without thinking too much about it. But John noticed something. They had cigarettes. That was enough for him to stop. He didn't hesitate at all. He just walked over to them and started talking, asking if he could get one. It was such a casual decision, something he had probably done many times before, without any issue. To him, it was normal. To me, it felt a little uncomfortable, but not enough to say anything. I stayed close to him, not really wanting to get involved, but also not wanting to stand there alone or walk away. At first, everything seemed fine. They were talking, the way people do in those small, passing interactions. There was nothing obviously wrong in those first few seconds. It felt like it would be over quickly, like we would just move on and keep walking. Then one of the men looked at me. It wasn't just a quick glance. It was the kind of look that lingers a little too long, the kind that makes you aware of yourself in a way you don't want to be. There was something in his expression that I didn't like, something that made me feel exposed, even though I couldn't explain why. He asked John if I was his girlfriend. The question itself might not sound strange on the surface, but the way he said it made all the difference. There was a tone behind it, something that felt off, something that made the air around me feel heavier. It didn't feel like curiosity. It felt like something else, something I couldn't fully name at the time, but I knew I didn't like it. John answered quickly, almost automatically, saying no, that I was his sister. I don't know what made him say that. Maybe he thought it would make the situation feel less threatening. Or maybe it was just the first thing that came to his mind. But whatever his intention was, it didn't change anything. The man kept looking at me. That feeling of being watched didn't go away. If anything, it became stronger. Then he started asking me questions directly. What's your name? How old are you? The questions came one after another, and even though they were simple, they didn't feel harmless. There was something about the way he asked them that made it clear he wasn't just making conversation. It felt like he was trying to figure something out. Like he was sizing me up in a way that made me want to step back. I didn't answer right away. I didn't want to. Every instinct in me was starting to tell me that something wasn't right, even if I couldn't fully explain it yet. And then he said something that made everything snap into focus. He asked how much for an hour. For a moment, I didn't understand. My brain didn't process it right away because it was so sudden, so inappropriate, so far from what I expected to hear. But when it did sink in, it felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. Everything around me seemed to go quiet for a second. John didn't know how to respond. I could tell just by the way he reacted. He made this awkward sound, something between confusion and disbelief, like his mind had stalled. It wasn't an answer. It was the kind of reaction you have when you don't even know how to begin responding to what you just heard. And in that small moment of hesitation, everything escalated. The man stood up. The movement was quick and sudden enough that it caught me off guard. Before I could fully react, he reached out and grabbed me. His grip was tight, much stronger than I expected. And it immediately shifted everything from uncomfortable to terrifying. He started pulling me toward a nearby alley. That was the moment it became real in a way that couldn't be ignored or misunderstood. There was no confusion anymore, no questioning what was happening. It was clear, immediate, and dangerous. I started screaming. It wasn't something I thought about. It just happened. The sound came out of me automatically, loud and desperate. At the same time, I was struggling, kicking, trying to pull away from him. My body moved on instinct, doing whatever it could to break free. Time felt strange in that moment, Everything was happening fast, but it also felt stretched out. Like each second lasted longer than it should have. I could feel his hand gripping me, pulling me, and all I could think about was getting away. There was no plan, no clear thought process, just pure reaction. Then John moved. It happened so quickly I barely saw it. He stepped forward and punched the man in the face with enough force to make him let go of me. It wasn't a clean, perfect moment like you might imagine. It was messy, sudden, driven by instinct more than anything else. But it worked. The man's grip loosened, and that was all I needed. The moment I felt even a small release, I pulled myself away completely. I didn't look back right away. I didn't think about anything except getting out of there. We ran. Both of us took off as fast as we could, not even needing to say anything to each other. It was understood. We just ran, putting as much distance as possible between us and that alley, that man, that entire situation. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. My breathing was uneven, sharp, like I couldn't get enough air. My mind was still trying to catch up with what had just happened, still trying to process how quickly everything had changed. And then, as we were running, I heard something that stuck with me more than anything else. They were laughing. Not just one of them, but both of them. It wasn't normal laughter. It wasn't light or harmless. There was something dark in it, something that made it sound wrong, like they didn't see what had just happened as anything serious at all. The sound followed us as we ran, echoing behind us in a way that made it feel like it was chasing us, even when we couldn't see them anymore. We didn't stop until we were far enough away to feel some kind of safety. Even then, it didn't feel completely real. It was like my body was still in that moment, still reacting to something that had already passed. My hands were shaking. My chest felt tight. My thoughts were scattered, jumping from one thing to another without settling. 1 minute we had been walking around, just looking for something to do, enjoying the night in a simple way. The next, I had been grabbed and pulled toward an alley by someone I didn't know. That kind of shift doesn't feel natural. It doesn't feel like something that should happen so quickly. Afterward, the fear didn't just disappear. It stayed with me, sitting quietly beneath everything else. It showed up in small ways at first. The way I looked at people, especially at night. The way I paid attention to who was around me, where I was standing, how close I was to exits or open spaces. The way I started noticing details I would have ignored before. It also changed the way I trusted situations that seemed normal. Before that night, I would have thought nothing of stopping for a quick conversation like that. I wouldn't have thought about what could go wrong in a matter of seconds. But after that, I understood how quickly something harmless can turn into something dangerous. Even now, sometimes my mind goes back to that moment, to the what-ifs. What if John hadn't reacted when he did? What if I hadn't been able to break free? What if we hadn't run fast enough? Those are the kinds of thoughts that don't lead anywhere good. They open up possibilities that are better left alone, but they still come back sometimes, uninvited. And that's the thing about experiences like that. They don't stay neatly in the past. They become part of how you see the world. They sharpen something in you, something that pays attention to small details, to tone, to body language, to that quiet feeling that tells you when something isn't right. And even though it only lasted a few minutes, the memory stayed clear. Not because of how long it happened, but because of how close it came to becoming something much worse. When I was about 14 or 15, a group of us decided we wanted to go camping. There were around 5 of us in total. And like most plans at that age, it wasn't anything carefully organized. It was more of a spontaneous idea that sounded exciting in the moment. Just getting out of town, being somewhere different, and having a night away from home felt like enough of an adventure. One of my friends mentioned that his parents were in the process of building a new house way out west of town. It wasn't finished yet, but the main structure was already up. The foundation had been laid, the walls and roof were in place, but there were no doors installed yet. It was still open in a lot of ways, unfinished and exposed. To us, that didn't sound like a problem at all. If anything, it made it feel more like an adventure. The location itself was part of what made it so appealing. The house was extremely secluded. It took several dirt roads just to get there, and once you arrived, it felt like you were completely cut off from everything else. There were a few neighboring properties somewhere in the distance, but they were far enough away that you could barely see them. Most of what surrounded the place was just open land, fields stretching out in every direction, with a few cows grazing here and there. Right behind the house, there was a small lake, quiet and still, adding to the isolated feeling of the whole place. When we got there, it felt like we had the entire area to ourselves. We set up near the back of the house, close to the lake, and started a fire. As the sun went down, the atmosphere shifted in that familiar way it does outdoors. The sky darkened slowly, the air cooled, and the sounds around us changed. There was the crackling of the fire, the occasional rustle of something moving in the distance, and the low, constant presence of the lake nearby. At first, everything was completely normal. We were talking, joking around, just enjoying being out there together. There was no tension, no sense that anything was wrong. It felt like exactly what we had planned, just a simple night hanging out away from everything. After a while, though, we decided to move inside the house. Even though it wasn't finished, there were lights inside, which made it feel more comfortable than sitting out in the dark. The idea of being inside, with actual walls and some light, sounded better as the night went on. So we started heading in together. One of our friends hung back for a moment. He said he needed to take a piss, so he stayed outside while the rest of us went in ahead of him. It didn't seem like a big deal. We just kept moving, assuming he'd catch up in a minute. When he finally came inside, though, something was off. He didn't look normal. He seemed shaken, distracted in a way that didn't match the relaxed mood we had all been in just a few minutes earlier. He came in and said, pretty seriously, that he had seen someone outside. At first, none of us really believed him. It sounded like the kind of thing someone would say as a joke, especially in a setting like that. We laughed it off, calling him out, saying he was just trying to mess with us. But he didn't laugh. He kept insisting that he had actually seen someone out there. That's when the mood started to shift. There's a certain moment when something goes from being a joke to something you're not so sure about anymore. It wasn't instant, but it crept in. The more serious he seemed, the more we started to second-guess things. We were in the middle of nowhere. No doors on the house. Wide open land all around us. The idea that someone could be out there without us knowing didn't feel completely impossible. That's when we started getting a little uneasy. Instead of brushing it off completely, we began looking around for anything we could use as a weapon, even if it was just for peace of mind. It wasn't anything serious, just whatever we could grab nearby. Pieces of wood, random objects, anything that made us feel a little less exposed. At some point, we decided to head toward the front of the house to check things out. There was a strange mix of nervous energy and fake confidence in the way we were acting. We were talking loudly, saying things like we'd mess someone up if they were really out there, trying to convince ourselves more than anything else. I remember I had picked up a long metal pole, holding it like I was actually ready to use it if I had to. Looking back, it was a mix of fear and adrenaline, covered up by acting tougher than we really felt. We stood out front for a bit, scanning the area, trying to see if anything looked out of place. The land stretched out in front of us, quiet and dark. There was nothing obvious, nothing moving, nothing that confirmed what our friend had said. And then we heard something. The noise came from inside the house. It was sudden, unexpected, and loud enough to break whatever sense of control we thought we had. All of us froze for a second, trying to figure out what we had just heard. It didn't sound like something small. It sounded like movement, like someone or something was actually inside. The energy shifted immediately. All that fake confidence disappeared, replaced by real confusion and tension. None of us said much, but we all knew we had to go back in and see what it was. We moved back inside together, more cautious this time. Once we were in the living room area, we stopped and looked around. Everything seemed still again, but the feeling had changed. It no longer felt like a place we were just hanging out in. It felt uncertain, like something could be around any corner. One of my friends and I decided we would check the rest of the house. We didn't really discuss it much. It just kind of happened. We moved toward the hallway, leaving the others behind, both of us trying to stay calm, even though the tension was building. The hallway felt longer than it probably was. Every step felt louder, more noticeable. The light didn't reach as well down there, and the shadows seemed deeper. We moved slowly, paying attention to every sound, every small detail. Eventually, we reached the master bathroom. The layout of it was a little unusual. The shower area had a wall facing the door, and you could enter it from either side. It created a kind of blind spot where you couldn't see what was inside until you actually stepped in. We paused for a second, then decided to check it. My friend had a flashlight, so he took the left side, and I went around to the right. We didn't say much. I just moved into position. As I got closer, I could see the light from his flashlight reflecting off the wall on the other side. I could also see a shadow moving, just enough to tell that something was there. That was the moment everything inside me tensed up. Without really thinking, I stepped around the corner, and there he was. A man I had never seen before, standing right there in front of me. For a split second, we just looked at each other. I was still holding that metal pole, the one I had picked up earlier, like it was going to make a difference. But in that moment, none of that mattered. Every bit of confidence I thought I had disappeared instantly. I yelled. Not a controlled shout, not something planned, just a full instinctive reaction. The sound came out of me without any thought behind it. And then I ran. I didn't swing the pole. I didn't hesitate. I didn't even stay long enough to process what I was seeing. I turned and ran out of that room as fast as I could, leaving everything behind, including the idea that I was going to confront anything. I regrouped with the others, trying to explain what I had just seen. Everyone started freaking out. The energy in the room turned chaotic, voices overlapping, people trying to figure out what to do next. The idea that there was actually someone inside the house made everything feel real in a way we hadn't been prepared for. Then I realized something. My friend, the one who had gone into the bathroom with me, wasn't there. For a moment, that made everything worse. My mind jumped to the worst possible conclusions, thinking about what could have happened to him. But then he walked out, and he wasn't alone. With him were his sister and his older male cousin. It took a second to understand what was happening. They had been hiding in the house. The whole thing had been planned as a way to scare us, and it worked. They had managed to stay hidden long enough, make just enough noise, and time everything perfectly so that by the time we went to check, the tension was already built up. Seeing someone standing there in that moment, in that setting, was enough to completely overwhelm any sense of logic. The fear we felt was real, even if the situation itself wasn't dangerous in the end. When it all settled down, there was this mix of relief and leftover adrenaline. We laughed about it eventually, but it took time. In that moment, it didn't feel funny at all. Looking back, that was easily one of the most scared I had ever been in my life. Not because anything actually happened, but because for those few minutes, it felt like something could have. And that feeling was more than enough. I've had a lot of strange moments in my life, but this is one of the few that has never really settled in my mind, no matter how much time has passed. It's not just because it was strange, but because it happened twice, almost exactly the same way, separated by months. And that's the part that always comes back to me. One strange moment can be explained away if you try hard enough. You can blame your imagination, your tired mind, or something small you misunderstood. But when the same thing happens again in the same place, in the same way, it becomes a lot harder to ignore. This happened sometime around 2007. I was living at my dad's house back then, and the setting plays a big role in how everything felt. The house wasn't in a busy area. It wasn't in a neighborhood full of people or activity. It was far out, surrounded by open space, meaning where everything felt quiet in a way that most people don't experience every day. There were no streetlights glowing outside the windows, no sound of cars passing by every few minutes, no voices carrying through the night. Once it got dark, it felt like the world slowed down completely. During the day, it was peaceful. But at night, that same quiet could feel heavy. Not necessarily frightening, just very still. The kind of stillness where even the smallest sound feels louder than it should. A floorboard creaking, a shift in the air, even your own movement in bed could stand out more than usual. It's something you only really notice when you're in a place that isolated. The house itself never felt wrong. There was no bad feeling attached to it. No strange history. No stories that made you uneasy. Nothing that made you uncomfortable, just being inside. It was just a normal house in a very quiet location. That's why what happened stood out so much. It didn't match the place at all. It didn't match the way things usually felt. Back then, I had a habit of staying up late, really late. It wasn't unusual for me to be awake at 3 in the morning, sometimes even later. The night had a different feeling when you stayed up that long, especially in a place like that. It felt like you were awake while everything else was asleep. The world outside was completely still, and even inside the house, it felt like everything had settled into silence. On the first night it happened, I was lying in bed watching a movie. I remember feeling completely relaxed. There was nothing on my mind, nothing bothering me. I was just focused on the screen, letting time pass the way it usually did on nights like that. The room was dim, lit mostly by the soft flicker of the TV. Shadows moved gently across the walls as the scenes changed. But it was the kind of movement you don't even notice after a while. Everything felt normal. And then, without any warning at all, something hit the bed right next to my face. It wasn't light. It wasn't something you could brush off as a small movement. It felt strong, solid, like someone had taken their fist and slammed it down with full force into the mattress right beside me. The impact was immediate and sharp, and my body reacted before my mind even had time to process it. I jumped up instantly. My heart started racing, and for a moment I didn't even know why. It was just a sudden rush of adrenaline. Like my body understood something had happened before my thoughts caught up. I looked down at the spot where I had felt the impact, expecting to see something there. My first thought was that something must have fallen. Maybe something from the ceiling or something that had been sitting somewhere and dropped. That was the only explanation that made sense in that moment. The force of what I felt didn't seem like something that could just come from nowhere. But when I looked, there was nothing. The bed was exactly the same. The sheets hadn't moved in any noticeable way. There was nothing lying on top of them. Nothing on the floor beside the bed. Nothing anywhere that could explain what had just happened. I looked around the room, checking everything I could think of. The ceiling was fine. The walls were the same. Nothing had shifted or fallen or changed in any way. It was like the impact had happened, but left no trace behind. That's when the confusion started to set in. I sat there for a while, trying to make sense of it. My heart was still beating fast, but my mind was already trying to calm things down, trying to find a reason that would make everything feel normal again. I started questioning myself. Maybe it was just a muscle jerk. Maybe my body had twitched in a way that felt stronger than it actually was. Maybe I had started to drift off without realizing it and imagined the whole thing. The more I thought about it, the less certain I became. Eventually, I pushed it aside. I didn't tell my dad. I didn't bring it up to anyone. It felt strange, but also not important enough to hold on to. As time passed, it slowly faded into the background of my memory. It became one of those moments you remember once in a while, but don't really focus on, until it happened again. It wasn't the next day or even the next week. Months had gone by. Enough time that I wasn't thinking about it anymore. Life had gone back to normal. My routine hadn't changed. I was still staying up late, still lying in bed at night, still surrounded by that same quiet. And then one night, out of nowhere, it happened again. The exact same feeling. Something slammed down onto the bed right next to my face. The force was identical, just as strong, just as sudden, just as real. It didn't feel different in any way. It was like the same moment had repeated itself perfectly, down to the smallest detail. My body reacted instantly again, jumping up the second it happened. But this time, there was something different. I recognized it, that feeling, that exact sensation, was something I had already experienced before. And the moment I realized that, the fear hit much harder. It wasn't just confusion anymore. It was the understanding that this had already happened once, and now it was happening again in the exact same way. I looked down at the bed again, almost expecting to finally see something this time. There was still nothing. The room was exactly as it had been before. Quiet, still, unchanged. No sign of anything that could explain the impact. No object, no movement, nothing at all. But I knew what I had felt. And I knew I hadn't imagined it. Not twice. That second time stayed with me in a way the first one hadn't. Felt heavier, more real. The fact that it had repeated itself made it impossible to dismiss completely. My mind kept going over it again and again, trying to find some kind of explanation, but nothing fit. I didn't go back to sleep that night. I stayed awake, sitting there in the dim light of the TV, listening to the silence around me. Every small sound felt louder than usual. The quiet that had once felt normal now felt different, like it was holding something I couldn't see. I kept looking around the room, expecting something else to happen, but nothing did. It was just me, the same room, and that unanswered question. 2 times isn't a coincidence. That thought kept repeating in my mind. It felt like there had to be a reason for it, something that made sense, but no matter how much I tried to figure it out, I couldn't. After that night, it never happened again. Yeah, not once. I kept living in that house. I kept staying up late. I kept doing the same things I had always done. Nights came and went, quiet and uneventful, just like before. But that specific experience never returned, and in a strange way that made it even harder to understand. If it had kept happening, maybe I would have found some kind of pattern. Maybe I would have noticed something I had missed before. But the fact that it happened twice, in the exact same way, months apart, and then stopped completely, left it unresolved. Even now, I can still remember exactly how it felt. The sudden impact right beside my face, the immediate reaction, jumping up without thinking, the silence that followed, with nothing there to explain it. And that same question that never really goes away, no matter how much time passes. What actually hit the bed that night? When I was 18 years old, I was living in a small town called Hillsborough in Northern Ireland. The town sits about 10 to 15 miles outside of Belfast, and while it's known for its quiet village charm today, anyone familiar with the history of the UK and Ireland knows that Northern Ireland carried a very different atmosphere for much of the 20th century. For decades, the region had been shaped by political conflict, tension, and violence that affected everyday life in ways people outside the area sometimes struggle to understand. Even though the period I grew up in was far calmer than the most intense years of the Troubles, the shadow of that history still lingered in the background. Stories of bombings, attacks, and unrest were not distant legends told in history books. They were events that had happened within living memory, sometimes in the very streets where people walked every day. Because of that, certain sounds or sudden disturbances could trigger an immediate sense of alarm. Even if you had never personally experienced violence, the awareness that it had happened before created a kind of instinctive reaction when something unusual occurred. At the time, I was working a part-time job in a small shop located right in the center of the village. It was the kind of place where locals came in throughout the day for groceries, small necessities, or just to chat for a few minutes with whoever was behind the counter. The work itself wasn't anything extraordinary. Most of my shifts involved stocking shelves, running the till, and helping customers find what they needed. Still, as a teenager, it felt like an important step toward independence. Earning my own money, interacting with people in the community, and learning how to manage responsibilities all gave me a sense of growing up. One particular day during the summer stands out clearly in my memory. It had been a fairly normal shift. The weather was pleasant, and because it was summer, the daylight lingered longer into the evening. By the time the shop was closing, there was still plenty of light outside. A colleague and I were in the process of finishing up for the day. Closing the shop involved a routine we followed every evening. We had to count the money from the tills, balance the cash drawers, and record the totals before locking everything away. We were standing behind the counter, quietly focusing on the numbers, when something happened that completely shattered the calm atmosphere. Without warning, there was a massive blast outside. The sound was incredibly loud. It wasn't just a sharp bang like a car backfiring. It was deeper, heavier, the kind of explosive sound that seemed to shake the entire building. The windows rattled violently in their frames. Dust fell from the ceiling tiles above us, and for a moment I could actually feel the faint pressure of the blast ripple through the air. Everything inside the shop froze. The suddenness of the noise made my heart jump instantly into my throat. My mind didn't even have time to process what might have caused it before instinct took over. In Northern Ireland, especially during that era, a blast like that triggered one immediate thought: a bomb. Even though incidents had become far less common by the time I was 18, the possibility was never completely absent from people's minds. I dropped what I was doing and hurried toward the front of the shop. The door was already locked because we were in the middle of closing procedures, but the large glass panels in the door allowed a clear view of the street outside. When I looked through the glass, the scene in front of me was almost surreal. The street that had been busy only a short while earlier was now completely empty. There were no pedestrians, no cars passing by. Instead, the entire road seemed to be covered with debris and a thick cloud of dust that hung in the air like a fog. Small pieces of something dark were scattered across the pavement. For a second, my brain struggled to make sense of what I was seeing. The silence outside felt eerie, almost unnatural after such a powerful explosion. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every instinct told me something terrible had just happened. Without really thinking it through, I unlocked the front door. The metal latch clicked open, and I pushed the door outward. Stepping outside, I was hit immediately by the smell of rubber and dust hanging in the air. The street still looked chaotic. Bits of black material were scattered everywhere, covering parts of the road and sidewalk. I stood there for a moment, trying to understand what had caused the explosion. Then I saw it. A massive crane truck was sitting in the middle of the street. It was one of those enormous vehicles used for construction work, the kind that combines a large truck with a crane arm mounted on the back. The tires alone were enormous, easily several feet tall. One of those tires had completely blown apart. From the look of it, the tire had disintegrated suddenly while the truck was moving through the center of town. The pressure inside those giant tires is enormous, and when one fails catastrophically, it can release energy almost like a small explosion. Rubber fragments had been thrown across the street, which explained the debris scattered everywhere. The dust cloud I'd seen from inside the shop was caused by the force of the tire bursting and the vehicle coming to an abrupt stop. Once I realized what had actually happened, the wave of fear that had hit me earlier began to fade. It hadn't been a bomb. It was simply a mechanical failure. Still, the sound had been so loud and violent that it had instantly triggered that old reflexive fear people in Northern Ireland carried for years. The driver of the truck had climbed out and was inspecting the damage, clearly shaken, but thankfully unharmed. Other people slowly began emerging from nearby buildings and shops, drawn by the sound just like I had been. Everyone looked around with the same mixture of confusion and relief as they realized the cause of the blast. Even though the tire explosion had sounded terrifying, it was incredibly fortunate that no one had been standing close to the truck when it happened. Those huge tires can throw heavy pieces of rubber and metal with enough force to seriously injure someone. As the dust began to settle and people started talking about what had happened, the tension in the air gradually disappeared. But the memory of that moment, the sudden blast, the shaking windows, the empty street covered in debris, stayed with me long afterward. For a brief few seconds, my mind had jumped straight to the worst possible explanation. And in a place with the history Northern Ireland carries, that reaction wasn't unusual at all, even though the real cause turned out to be nothing more than a truck tire blowing out. The experience reminded me how powerful those old instincts could be, and how quickly the mind can leap from confusion to fear when something unexpected shatters the quiet of an ordinary evening. When I was about 7 years old, my family took a vacation that required us to drive a long distance from home. At that age, family trips felt like a big adventure. Every hour on the road felt like part of a story, even if most of the time we were simply passing through unfamiliar towns and landscapes that blended together in a child's memory. The destination that year was Seattle. I don't remember every detail about the trip itself, but I do remember how excited we were when the idea of traveling there first came up. My parents talked about the long drive, the places we might see along the way, and the sights that made the city famous. For my siblings and me, the excitement wasn't really about the destination itself. It was about being on a trip together, staying in new places, and seeing things that were different from our normal everyday life. At that age, even the simple act of sitting in the back seat of a car for hours could feel like an adventure. The road trip took us through many places I couldn't name now. Highways stretched out for miles, and sometimes we would stop at gas stations or roadside diners where everything looked a little different from home. I remember watching the scenery through the car window as the landscape changed slowly with every passing mile. Eventually, we reached the Seattle area. Cities always felt exciting to me when I was a kid. The buildings were taller, the roads busier, and everything seemed larger than life. As we drove through the streets, I remember leaning forward in my seat to look at the bridges, traffic, and unfamiliar neighborhoods. At some point during that drive, something unexpected happened. Our car suddenly slowed down. Traffic ahead of us had stopped almost completely, and there were police vehicles scattered along the road. Their lights flashed brightly, casting red and blue reflections across the surrounding cars. As a child, I didn't immediately understand why we had stopped. To me, it simply felt like a delay in the middle of the trip. But the atmosphere inside our car began to change. My parents' voices became quieter and more serious. They were watching something ahead of us, speaking in low tones that made it clear something unusual was happening. I followed their gaze and looked ahead. There was a bridge in front of us. It stretched across the road, rising above the traffic like a tall structure made of steel and concrete. Bridges had always fascinated me as a kid. Oh, so naturally I stared up at it with curiosity. At the edge of the bridge, I saw a man standing. He was near the railing, looking down toward the road below. At first, I didn't think anything of it. People stand on bridges all the time. From a child's perspective, it looked like he might simply be looking at the view or watching the traffic pass beneath him. But my older sister reacted very differently. She was about 4 years older than I was, which meant she was just old enough to understand what might be happening. She began to cry. The moment she started crying, I realized that something serious was going on. My mom tried to calm her down. She spoke gently and told her to look away from the bridge. Her voice had a reassuring tone, but there was also tension behind it. At that point, I still didn't fully understand the situation. I remember sitting there quietly in my seat, watching everything unfold with the kind of curiosity that children sometimes have when they don't yet understand danger. From my perspective, the scene felt confusing, but not frightening. There were police cars. There was a man standing on the bridge. People in other cars were looking up at him as well. But the meaning behind it all hadn't fully registered in my mind. For a few minutes, everything seemed to pause. Traffic remained stopped. Police officers were positioned nearby. The man on the bridge remained standing at the edge. I remember hearing bits of conversation from adults in nearby cars, though I didn't understand what they were saying at the time. Then suddenly something changed. The man moved. Before anyone could react, he climbed over the edge of the bridge, and then he jumped. For a split second, my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. I watched as his body fell from the bridge toward the ground below. Time seemed to slow down in that moment. The image of him falling stayed in my vision long enough for the reality of the situation to finally sink in. That was the moment I understood what had been happening. The man had jumped intentionally, and I had just witnessed it. The shock hit me immediately. Fear rushed through my chest, and suddenly, the situation that had seemed confusing before became terrifying. I started to panic. My heart began pounding, and I remember feeling overwhelmed by a kind of fear that I had never experienced before. As a child, moments like that can be incredibly difficult to understand. You don't yet have the emotional tools to process something so serious. And all you know is that something very bad has happened, and you were there to see it. My parents tried to calm us down as best they could. They spoke softly, telling us not to look and trying to distract us from what had just occurred. Eventually, traffic began moving again. The police remained behind as the rest of the vehicles slowly continued forward. But the atmosphere in our car had completely changed. The excitement of the road trip had been replaced by silence. For a while, no one spoke very much. I remember looking out the window, trying to understand what I'd seen. Children sometimes struggle to place events like that into context. At 7 years old, I didn't fully understand why someone would choose to jump from a bridge. I only knew that it had happened suddenly, and that it had frightened everyone around me. Over time, the memory slowly faded. As years passed, it became one of those moments buried somewhere deep in my mind. Life moved forward. School, friends, growing up, and countless other experiences gradually pushed that memory further and further into the background. For many years, I didn't think about it at all. It wasn't something that came up in conversation, and eventually it seemed like it had simply disappeared from my thoughts. Then one day, about 13 years later, something unexpected happened. I was reading through a discussion online where people were sharing experiences from their past. Someone mentioned witnessing something disturbing while they were younger, and suddenly the memory came back, clear and vivid. It was as if my mind had stored the moment away somewhere deep inside, and then suddenly unlocked it. I could see the bridge again. I could see the flashing police lights. I could hear my sister crying in the back seat. And I could remember the exact moment when the man stepped over the railing. The memory returned with surprising clarity. Even after so many years, the images and emotions were still there, waiting quietly until something triggered them. Moments like that remind us how powerful memory can be. Our minds sometimes hold on to experiences even when we believe we have forgotten them. They remain hidden beneath the surface until something unexpected brings them back. Looking back now as an adult, I understand the situation much better than I did as a child. But that moment from the road trip to Seattle remains one of the most vivid memories from my early years. It started as an ordinary vacation day, and then, without warning, it became something I would remember for the rest of my life. My aunt has lived most of her life in a very quiet, rural part of Indiana. The area where she lives is the kind of place where houses are scattered far apart, separated by long stretches of farmland, narrow roads, and thick patches of trees. If you stand on her porch and look out across the land, you can see fields stretching for miles. Sometimes you might see a barn or another farmhouse in the distance, but there are not many neighbors close by. It is the sort of place where people know each other well because there simply aren't many people around. When someone drives past the house, you notice it. When a stranger appears on the road, it stands out immediately. For people who live in big cities, that kind of quiet countryside might sound peaceful. And in many ways it is. But living in a remote area also means you become very aware of who belongs there and who does not. My aunt had grown used to that rhythm of rural life. She raised her children there and spent most of her days working around the house or outside in the yard. She knew the farmers who lived down the road, the families who owned the nearby fields, and the occasional delivery drivers who passed through. But strangers rarely came to her door. That's why the day this happened stood out so strongly in her memory. It was a normal afternoon. The weather was calm, and my aunt was at home with her kids. They were young at the time and usually spent their afternoons playing inside or outside, depending on the season. The house sat back slightly from the road with a small front porch that faced the driveway. From the porch, you could see the gravel road that ran past the property. It was a quiet road where only a few vehicles passed each day. At some point during the afternoon, there was a knock on the door. That alone was unusual enough to make her pause. When she opened the door, she found a man standing on the porch. He was dressed neatly and carried a bag with him. From his appearance and the way he introduced himself, it became clear that he was trying to sell Bibles. Now, in many parts of the country, door-to-door salespeople used to be more common than they are today. Some people sold magazines. Others sold cleaning products, and occasionally someone might try to sell religious materials. But the situation felt strange almost immediately. My aunt later explained that it didn't make much sense for someone to be going door to door selling Bibles in that particular area. The countryside around her house was already very religious. Most of the people living nearby already owned several Bibles and attended church regularly. On top of that, there simply weren't many houses in the area. For a salesperson trying to reach as many customers as possible, it seemed like a very inefficient place to work. Still, the man greeted her politely and began explaining the Bible he was selling. His voice was cheerful, and he spoke in a bright, enthusiastic tone that almost sounded rehearsed. My aunt listened politely for a moment before explaining that she already owned a Bible and had no interest in buying another one. Normally, that would be the end of the conversation. But this man didn't leave. Instead, he continued talking as if she had not said anything. He kept smiling, and that smile never changed. She described it later as the most unsettling part of the encounter. Throughout the entire conversation, his expression remained exactly the same. His face held a wide, cheerful grin that never faded, even when she told him repeatedly that she wasn't interested. His voice stayed upbeat and friendly, but something about it felt unnatural. My aunt tried again to explain that she did not need another Bible. She told him that she already had one and that she appreciated his visit, but wasn't interested in making a purchase. Still, he continued his sales pitch. Minute after minute passed as he stood there on the porch with the same unchanging smile. At this point, my aunt began to feel uncomfortable. Living in a rural area teaches you to trust your instincts about strangers. Most people who stop by are polite and respectful, but when someone ignores clear requests to leave, it raises immediate concern. She told him firmly that she was not going to buy anything and that he needed to go, but he remained standing there, still smiling, still speaking in the same cheerful tone. That's when she decided to be more direct. She told him that she owned a gun, and that if he did not leave her property immediately, she would not hesitate to use it. For most people, hearing something like that would be enough to end the conversation instantly. But the man's reaction was not what she expected. He did not become angry. He did not seem frightened. He did not even stop smiling. Instead, he responded in the exact same upbeat voice he had been using the entire time. Without changing his expression, he said something that chilled her immediately. "You wouldn't want blood all over your nice porch, would you?" The way he said it made the situation suddenly feel much more serious. The cheerful tone of his voice did not match the words he had spoken. That contrast made the moment feel deeply unsettling. Without saying another word, my aunt quickly slammed the door shut. She locked it immediately. Then she rushed to gather her children. Her instincts were telling her that something was very wrong, and she did not want to take any chances. She took the kids into the bathroom and locked the door behind them. In many homes, bathrooms are one of the few rooms with solid locks and no easy access from outside, so it felt like the safest place to hide. The children could tell their mother was frightened, which made them anxious as well. For a few minutes, they sat there quietly in the bathroom, listening for any sounds outside. My aunt expected to hear footsteps on the porch or knocking on the door, but there was nothing. The house was completely silent. Eventually, she moved toward the small bathroom window and carefully looked outside. The view from that window allowed her to see part of the yard and the road beyond the property. What she saw surprised her. The man was gone. There was no one standing on the porch. There was no one walking down the driveway. And there were no vehicles on the road. In every direction she could see, the road was empty. The entire area looked exactly the way it had before the man arrived. Quiet. Still. As if nothing had happened. My aunt stayed in the bathroom with her kids for a while longer, just to be safe. Eventually, she checked the rest of the house to make sure everything was secure. The doors were still locked. Nothing appeared disturbed. But the encounter stayed with her for a long time. Even years later, she would sometimes talk about that moment and the strange feeling it gave her. What bothered her the most was not just the man's refusal to leave. It was the way he spoke, that constant cheerful tone, that unchanging smile, and the strange comment about blood on the porch. In rural places where people rely heavily on instinct and awareness, moments like that stand out sharply. Because when someone behaves in a way that feels wrong, even if nothing actually happens afterward, the memory stays with you. And for my aunt, that afternoon in rural Indiana became one of those stories she would never forget. It's like this: true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions. Please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. When I was about 13 years old, I spent a weekend with my mom at my grandparents' house out in the countryside. Their home sat far away from the busy parts of town, surrounded by thick trees, open land, and long stretches of quiet road. For most people, it probably looked peaceful and relaxing. But as a kid who grew up more used to neighborhoods and streetlights, the place sometimes felt a little too quiet for comfort. My grandparents' house stood on a piece of land that was bordered by tall bushes and patches of trees that seemed to form a natural wall around the property. During the day, those bushes looked harmless enough. They were just part of the landscape, full of birds, insects, and the occasional squirrel moving through the branches. But at night, the entire area felt completely different. Once the sun went down, the countryside changed into something darker and more mysterious. There were no nearby streetlights, and the only light that reached the yard came from the house windows or the faint glow of the moon overhead. The bushes that had seemed ordinary during the day now looked like dark shapes piled together along the edges of the yard. That night, my mom had already gone to bed. It was late, probably close to 2 in the morning. I remember checking the time on my laptop while I sat in the living room. Back then, I had just started getting interested in using computers more often. And it was one of those quiet nights where I stayed up later than usual browsing the internet and watching random things online. The house was completely silent, the kind of silence you only really hear in the countryside. No traffic passing by, no neighbors making noise, no distant sounds of city life. Just the quiet creaking of the house settling and the occasional whisper of wind moving through the trees. I was sitting on the couch with my laptop balanced on my legs, the soft glow of the screen lighting up the living room. The rest of the room was dim, with only a small lamp turned on in the corner. At some point, I glanced up from the laptop and looked out the window. The window faced the backyard where those thick bushes grew along the edge of the property. At first, I wasn't really focusing on anything specific. I was just staring outside the way people sometimes do when they pause for a moment during a late night. Then something caught my attention. In the darkness beyond the window, I thought I could see something in the bushes. At first, it was just a shape, something that looked a little like a face, but it was difficult to make out clearly because of the darkness outside. The branches and leaves of the bushes created shadows that shifted slightly whenever the wind moved through them. For a moment, I felt a small surge of fear. Seeing something that resembles a face outside your window in the middle of the night is never a comforting experience. But almost immediately, I tried to calm myself down. I remembered reading something not long before that night about how the human brain is wired to recognize faces. The article explained that our minds naturally try to find face-like patterns in random shapes, shadows, or objects. It's a psychological effect where your brain fills in details even when nothing is really there. Once I remembered that explanation, I started to relax. I even laughed quietly to myself. I told myself that I was probably just looking at shadows and branches that happened to line up in a way that resembled a face. The bushes were dense and uneven, so it wouldn't be surprising if the shapes created strange illusions. So instead of panicking, I decided to test that idea. I kept staring at the shape in the bushes. The longer I looked, the more I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I leaned forward slightly and focused my eyes on the spot where I thought the face was. The living room remained completely quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of my laptop. Outside, the yard looked dark and still. For several seconds, nothing changed. The shape in the bushes stayed exactly where it was. I even started chuckling a little to myself. I was feeling somewhat proud that I had managed to calm down instead of jumping to conclusions. But then something happened that instantly erased that calm feeling. The shape blinked. At first, I thought I had imagined it. But then it happened again. The face I had been staring at closed its eyes and opened them. My stomach dropped immediately. The moment I saw that movement, every explanation I had used to calm myself down disappeared. It was no longer just a shadow or a pattern in the leaves. Something was there, and it had just blinked. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. I just stared at the bushes, completely frozen in place. Then, slowly, the shape began to move. The face that had been staring toward the house slowly pulled back into the darkness of the bushes. The movement was careful and deliberate. Whatever it was retreated deeper into the branches until it completely disappeared from view. The yard outside the window returned to darkness. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound. But I knew what I had seen. The feeling of fear that followed was unlike anything I had experienced before. My mind raced through every possible explanation. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe someone had been hiding in the bushes. Maybe it was just some strange trick of light and shadow. But the image of those eyes blinking stayed clear in my mind. I quickly closed my laptop and stood up from the couch. The living room suddenly felt much larger and darker than it had a few minutes earlier. Every window in the house now felt like an opening to the outside world. I walked quietly down the hallway to the room where I was sleeping. Once inside, I closed the door and climbed into bed. But there was no way I was going to sleep easily after what I had just seen. I grabbed the closest thing I could find that might serve as some kind of protection. A golf club. It was leaning against the wall in the room because my grandfather had left it there earlier. I held it tightly as I sat on the bed. Then I pulled the blankets up around myself, leaving only a small gap where I could see the door. For the rest of the night, I stayed awake. Every creak of the house made me tense up. Every movement of wind outside made me wonder if something was walking through the yard again. The golf club stayed beside me the entire time. I must have eventually fallen asleep just before morning because I remember waking up when sunlight started coming through the window. During the day, everything looked completely normal again. The bushes outside were just bushes. The yard looked peaceful and harmless. But even with the sunlight shining across the property, I couldn't shake the memory of what had happened the night before. I never saw that face again. But after that night, I never liked staying at my grandparents' house the same way I used to. Something about those bushes outside the window always made me uneasy. And even now, years later, I can still remember the exact moment when the shape in the darkness blinked and slowly retreated back into the bushes. When I was very young, probably somewhere around 6 or 7 years old, I spent a lot of my free time playing outside in the backyard of our house. It was one of those quiet suburban neighborhoods where kids could spend hours outdoors without worrying much about the world beyond the fence. Back then, life felt simple. My days were filled with school, cartoons, homework, and the long stretches of afternoon sunlight that seemed to last forever when you were a child. Our backyard wasn't very large, but to me it felt like my own little world. There was enough open space to run around, toss a ball, or sit in the grass watching clouds drift slowly across the sky. The fence along the back of the yard separated our property from a small road that ran behind several houses in the neighborhood. Cars passed by occasionally, but it wasn't a busy street. Most of the time it remained quiet. My parents liked that about the house. The yard gave us space to play, but it still felt safe because the road wasn't heavily used. They would often watch us through the kitchen window or step outside every now and then just to make sure everything was fine. On the day this happened, I remember being outside by myself. I had a baseball and a glove, and I was playing catch alone. Kids often find creative ways to entertain themselves when no one else is around. And one of my favorite things to do was throw the ball up into the air and try to catch it with my glove. Sometimes I would toss it against the side of the house and catch the rebound. Other times I would throw it straight up and wait for it to come back down. It wasn't a complicated game, but it kept me busy. The afternoon was warm and calm, the kind of quiet day where the neighborhood seemed peaceful. The sun was bright, and the grass in the yard felt soft under my feet. I threw the ball again and again, catching it most of the time and occasionally missing it when the throw went slightly off. At one point, I tossed the ball a little too hard. Instead of falling back toward me, it bounced off the ground at an angle and rolled across the yard toward the back fence. Before I could catch up to it, the ball slipped through a small opening near the edge of the yard and rolled out onto the road behind the house. I jogged toward the fence to see where it had gone. The ball had stopped near the edge of the road. Just as I was about to step closer to retrieve it, I heard the sound of a car approaching. A red car pulled up along the road and stopped. At that age, I didn't think much about it. Cars passed by occasionally, and I assumed the driver had simply stopped because the ball was in the road. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He walked over to where the ball had stopped and picked it up from the pavement. From where I stood in the yard, I watched him closely. He looked like an ordinary adult. Nothing about his appearance immediately stood out as unusual. He held the ball in one hand and turned toward me. Then he walked closer to the fence. He held the ball out toward me as if offering it back. From a child's perspective, the situation seemed simple. Someone had picked up my ball and was returning it. I walked toward the fence to take it. The man leaned slightly forward and held the ball out through the opening. For a moment, I reached toward it. But just before I could grab it, something strange happened. The man suddenly pulled his hand back. Without saying a word, he turned around and walked quickly back toward his car. He got into the driver's seat, closed the door, and drove away. The entire moment happened so quickly that I stood there confused, still reaching toward the space where the ball had been. I didn't understand why he had changed his mind. Why stop the car, pick up the ball, offer it back, and then suddenly leave before giving it to me? For a few seconds, I simply stood there staring at the empty road. Then I heard a voice behind me. It was my father. I turned around and saw that he had just stepped out of the house into the backyard. He had probably come outside to check on me the way parents often do when their children are playing alone. When I saw him standing there, I suddenly realized how close he had been to the moment when the man was by the fence. My dad asked me what I was doing near the back of the yard. I told him about the ball rolling into the road and how a man in a red car had picked it up. He looked toward the road for a moment, but the car was already gone. At the time, the situation didn't seem very important to me. I was a kid, and in my mind, it was just a strange moment that didn't make much sense. My father retrieved the ball from where it had been left near the road, handed it back to me, and told me to be careful about playing too close to the fence. Life went on normally after that. But a few weeks later, something happened that made the memory much more disturbing. The news spread through the neighborhood that a young child had been kidnapped in a nearby area. The story quickly became the kind of conversation that adults discussed quietly with serious expressions. Parents spoke about it with concern, and many of them became more cautious about letting their children play outside alone. What caught my father's attention was the description of the vehicle involved. The report said that the child had been taken by someone driving a red car. When my father heard that detail, he remembered the story I had told him about the man who stopped to pick up my ball. The description matched almost exactly. I didn't fully understand the significance of it at the time, but I remember the way my parents reacted when they talked about it later. Yeah, and their tone became serious and quiet in a way that made it clear the situation was more frightening than I realized as a child. Looking back on it now as an adult, the moment feels much more unsettling. At the time, I thought the man had simply changed his mind about returning the ball. But now it's impossible not to wonder what might have happened if my father hadn't stepped outside at that exact moment. From where I stood near the fence, I couldn't see the house behind me. If my father hadn't come out, the man might have realized that no adult was nearby. He might not have driven away. It's impossible to know what his intentions truly were. But the timing of everything still feels chilling. The ball rolled into the road. The red car stopped. The man picked up the ball and tried to lure me closer. And then, just before I could reach him, he noticed my father stepping outside. Within seconds, he left. Sometimes small moments in childhood only reveal their true meaning years later. At the time, I saw it as nothing more than a strange interaction with a stranger passing by. But after learning about the kidnapping that happened nearby, the memory took on a completely different weight. It became one of those experiences that reminds you how close danger can sometimes come without you realizing it, and how something as simple as a parent stepping outside at the right moment can make all the difference. One night, a friend of mine and I had gone out to the bars like we sometimes did on weekends. We were both younger then, the kind of age where staying out late felt normal, and the night always seemed full of possibilities. It had been a pretty typical evening: loud music, crowded rooms, drinks with friends, and the usual conversations that happen when people are enjoying a night out. By the time we left the last bar, it was around 1 in the morning. The streets of Charleston, West Virginia, had mostly quieted down by then, though a few people were still wandering around downtown finishing their nights. My friend and I were getting ready to call it a night when we got a message from another friend of ours. He had just moved into a new house and was throwing a small party. He told us to come out and join them. The problem was that his new place wasn't anywhere near the city. He lived out in a rural area called Pinch, which sits about 30 minutes outside Charleston, if you know the roads well enough. The area is mostly winding country roads, wooded hills, and the kind of quiet Appalachian hollers where houses are scattered far apart. Still, we were in the mood to keep the night going, so we decided to drive out there. At the time, it didn't seem like a big deal. 30 minutes isn't a long drive, and we assumed we would be there quickly enough. But there was one small problem. I am terrible with directions. Back then, we didn't have smartphones with GPS the way we do now. Instead, we were relying on a few vague directions our friend had given us over the phone, combined with our best guesses about which roads to take. That turned out to be a mistake. We started out on the main highway, heading in the general direction of Pinch, but after a while we had to turn off onto smaller roads. The farther we drove, the darker and more isolated the surroundings became. Streetlights disappeared. The houses became fewer and farther between. The road began twisting through wooded hills, sometimes climbing upward, and sometimes dipping down into valleys where the trees closed in tightly around both sides of the road. At first, we laughed about it. Getting lost during a late-night drive didn't seem like a big deal. We joked about my terrible navigation skills and how we should have written down better directions. But as the drive continued, the atmosphere began to change. The roads grew narrower. Eventually, we turned onto a small road that led deep into what locals call a holler. If you've never been in that part of Appalachia, a holler is basically a narrow valley surrounded by steep wooded hills. Often, there's just a single road running through it, with houses occasionally tucked along the sides. But the deeper we drove into this particular holler, the fewer signs of people we saw. There were no houses, no trailers, no lights in the distance, nothing but trees, darkness, and the winding road stretching ahead of us. The headlights of our car were the only real source of light. Everything beyond that glow was swallowed by the darkness of the woods. At some point, we both realized we were probably not on the right road anymore. But turning around on those narrow roads wasn't easy. So we kept driving forward, hoping we might eventually find a place where we could safely turn around. Then we saw something ahead. At first, it was just a shape emerging in the distance. As we got closer, the headlights illuminated a small clearing off the side of the road. And in that clearing stood a building, an old church. Even from the car, we could tell it was in rough condition. The structure looked extremely old, like it might have been built sometime in the 1950s or maybe even earlier. The wood siding was weathered and faded, and parts of the exterior looked like they had been damaged at some point. What really caught our attention was the front of the building. It looked like the church had been through a fire. The wood near the windows and parts of the roof appeared blackened and warped. as if flames had once burned through sections of it. Some areas had been patched up with pieces of plywood that didn't match the original structure. It gave the entire building a strange, abandoned appearance, the kind of place you would expect to see in an old horror movie. But the church itself wasn't the strangest part. Right beside it was something completely unexpected. A playground. Not an old rusted playground either. This one actually looked relatively new. The equipment included swings, a slide, and a small climbing structure that seemed to have been installed much more recently than the church itself. Seeing a playground next to a burned-out church deep in the middle of a dark holler was strange enough. But then we noticed something else. The entire property was surrounded by a fence. At first, that didn't seem unusual either. Lots of places have fences around them. But as we slowed the car and looked more closely, something about the fence stood out immediately. It was made of barbed wire, and the barbs were facing the wrong direction. Normally, barbed wire fences are designed to keep people or animals out. The sharp edges face outward to discourage anyone from climbing over. But this fence was different. The barbs were facing inward, as if the purpose of the fence was to keep something inside rather than outside. When we realized that, both of us fell silent for a moment. The headlights illuminated the church, the playground, and the strange fence surrounding them. The entire scene looked eerie in the middle of the dark woods. There were no lights anywhere on the property, no cars, no signs of anyone being there. Just that old damaged church and the playground sitting beside it, enclosed by a fence designed to keep something from getting out. Neither of us said much for a few seconds. Then my friend broke the silence with a nervous laugh and said something like, "Yeah, we are definitely not supposed to be here." I didn't argue with that. The place gave off a strange feeling that neither of us could quite explain. Maybe it was just the combination of the darkness, the isolation, and the strange appearance of the church. Or maybe it was the fence. Either way, neither of us felt like sticking around to investigate further. We quickly found a place to turn the car around and headed back down the road the way we had come. The deeper we drove away from that clearing, the more the normal world seemed to return. Eventually, we reached a larger road again and found our way back towards civilization. Later that night, we actually made it to our friend's party, though by then we were more interested in telling the story of the creepy church we had stumbled upon. Even years later, I still think about that place sometimes. I have no idea what the story behind that church was. Maybe it had burned years earlier and someone tried to repair it. Maybe the playground had been built for a small congregation that once used the building. Maybe the fence was there for some practical reason we didn't understand. But the image of that old burned church sitting in the middle of a dark Appalachian holler beside a playground surrounded by inward-facing barbed wire remains one of the strangest and creepiest things I have ever seen during a late-night drive. When I was very young, around 5 years old, I had a fear that stayed with me long after childhood. At that age, your world is small, but your imagination is huge. You don't fully understand danger, yet you sense it. You pick up on the tension in your neighborhood, the warnings from adults, the way people talk about certain streets or certain corners after dark. I was growing up in a rough part of town, and even though I was only 5, I knew that not everything outside our front door was safe. My younger brother was 4 at the time. We were close in age and close in spirit. We did everything together. If I went outside, he followed. If he wandered somewhere, I kept an eye on him. We didn't think of it as protection back then. It was just how siblings move when they are that young. But looking back now, I realize how instinctively protective I felt over him, even as a child myself. There was a small park not too far from our house. It wasn't fancy. It had a couple of swings, an old slide that got hot in the summer, and patches of grass that were more dirt than green. But to us, it was a place of freedom. It was where we could run, shout, and pretend. For kids living in a neighborhood where you had to be careful, that park felt like a little escape. One afternoon, my brother and I walked there together. I don't remember exactly what time of year it was, but I remember the air feeling still. Not too busy, not too crowded. There were moments when other kids were around, but this time it felt quieter than usual. Maybe there were a few adults sitting on benches. Maybe there weren't. Memory can blur details, but some parts of that day are crystal clear. At some point, my brother and I split up briefly. That's what kids do. One of us might have gone to the swings while the other wandered toward the edge of the playground. We weren't far apart, just out of arm's reach. We had agreed, or maybe just understood without saying it, that we would meet again at the edge of the park before heading home. When we came back together near the edge, something shifted. A black car pulled up along the curb near where we were standing. I remember the color clearly. Dark, smooth. The engine was running. The window rolled down. Inside the car was a white man. He leaned slightly toward the open window and spoke in a calm, almost casual tone. "Hey, you two want some candy?" It's strange how certain sentences stay frozen in your memory. I can still hear the rhythm of it. Not loud, not angry, almost friendly. At 5 years old, I knew enough to feel that something wasn't right. Maybe it was the way he said it. Maybe it was the way he was watching us. Maybe it was the constant warnings from adults about strangers. I don't remember feeling confused. I remember feeling alert. My brother stood there for a second. He was younger. Candy was tempting. It always is when you're that small. But I didn't hesitate for long. I said no. I reached for my brother's hand and grabbed it tightly. And then we ran. We didn't look back. We ran as fast as our short legs could carry us. I can still feel that rush in my chest when I think about it. The pounding in my ears, the urgency. I didn't know exactly what might have happened if we had stayed, but every instinct told me we had to leave. We ran all the way home. When we got inside, we told our mom. I don't remember every word of that conversation, but I remember her face changing. The seriousness, the shift from normal to protective. After that day, we didn't go outside for a week, maybe longer. The park that once felt like freedom suddenly felt dangerous. As a child, you don't process events the way adults do. You just feel them. That fear stayed with me. It wasn't loud. It didn't show up every day, but it lived quietly in the background. A reminder that something bad almost happened, or at least could have. Growing up in a rough neighborhood meant we were already exposed to things other kids might not have been. We heard arguments at night. We saw police cars more often than we probably should have. We knew which streets to avoid, but this was different. This wasn't something happening somewhere else. It was someone pulling up directly to us. The offer of candy is such a common warning story that it almost feels like a cliché. But when it happens in real life, it doesn't feel like a story. It feels immediate and personal. It feels like a test you didn't know you were going to have to pass. Looking back as an adult, I understand more about how predators operate. They often rely on friendliness, on seeming harmless, on speaking gently instead of aggressively. A calm voice can be more dangerous than an angry one. At 5 years old, I didn't know any of that. I just knew I felt uncomfortable. I think about what might have happened if I had hesitated longer, if I had laughed, if I had stepped closer. If my brother had moved toward the car before I grabbed him. Those thoughts can spiral if you let them. But I also remind myself that we did the right thing. We said no. We ran. We told an adult. That fear I felt that day never completely disappeared. Even now, years later, I'm cautious. When I see kids playing alone near a street, I notice it. When a car slows down near children, I pay attention. It's not paranoia. It's awareness. Some people might say that holding on to fear isn't healthy, but I see it differently. That fear protected us. It sharpened my instincts. It made me react instead of freeze. It taught me that discomfort is a signal worth listening to. For audiences in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada, this kind of story resonates because it taps into something universal. Every parent worries about strangers. Every child hears warnings about not getting into cars. Yet when it actually happens, it feels surreal. It's one thing to hear about danger on the news. It's another to see it roll up beside you. What stays with me most isn't the car itself. It's the feeling of responsibility I felt toward my brother. I was only 5, but in that moment I felt older. I felt like it was my job to protect him. I didn't think about it logically. I just acted. There's something powerful about that instinct. Even small children can sense when something is wrong. We sometimes underestimate how strong that inner alarm can be. After that week of staying inside, we eventually went back to the park. Life doesn't stop forever, but it was different. I stayed closer to my brother. I scanned the street more often. The world felt slightly less innocent. As I grew up, the memory didn't fade. It didn't traumatize me in a dramatic way, but it shaped me. It made me more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, more protective of the people I care about. Sometimes I wonder if that man pulled up to other children before or after us. I hope not. I hope that maybe he drove away and never tried again. But I'll never know. All I know is that we were lucky. There's a thin line between a story that becomes a headline and one that becomes a quiet memory. Ours became a memory, a warning, a lesson. I still have that fear in me. Not the overwhelming panic of that day, but the awareness, the understanding that danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it rolls up slowly, window down, voice calm. And honestly, I'm glad I still have that fear. It keeps me alert. It reminds me to trust my instincts. It reminds me that even at 5 years old, I had the ability to recognize something was wrong and act on it. That's not weakness. That's survival. What could have been a tragedy became a lesson, a moment that shaped how I see the world, a reminder that sometimes running is the bravest thing you can do. Some crimes are so shocking that when you first hear about them, they don't even feel real. They feel like something from a horror movie or a fictional thriller. But unfortunately, some of the worst stories in modern history are very real. One of those cases happened in Austria and involved a man named Joseph Fritzl. For years, people in his town saw him as an ordinary older man. He was married. He had children. He lived in a regular house in a quiet neighborhood. From the outside, there was nothing that suggested anything was wrong. That's often what makes cases like this so disturbing. The most horrific acts were hidden behind an ordinary front door. In 1984, Fritzl imprisoned his daughter, Elizabeth, in a hidden basement beneath the family home. She was only 18 years old at the time. He had constructed a concealed series of rooms behind a heavy door that required a code to unlock. The space was soundproofed and completely cut off from the outside world. There were no windows, no sunlight, no connection to time passing. For 24 years, Elizabeth was kept there. During that time, she was repeatedly assaulted by her father. Over those decades, she gave birth to 7 children in captivity. The conditions were cramped and unsanitary. Medical care was non-existent. The emotional and psychological trauma is impossible to fully comprehend. 3 of the children remained in the basement with Elizabeth. 3 others were brought upstairs and raised by Fritzl and his wife, as if they were abandoned babies left at their doorstep. 1 child died shortly after birth. According to court records, Fritzl disposed of that infant's body by burning it in a furnace. The way he maintained the deception for so long still shocks people. He told his wife that Elizabeth had run away and joined a cult. Over the years, he staged letters supposedly written by Elizabeth explaining that she did not want contact and that she had left some of her children at the house because she could not care for them. His wife, according to investigators, claimed she believed the story. Many people still question how someone living in the same home could remain unaware of such a hidden prison beneath their feet. But investigators later concluded that the basement area was heavily secured and not easily accessible. For decades, Elizabeth and the children in the basement lived in total isolation. The children born there had never seen daylight. They had no understanding of the outside world. Their only reality was that underground space. The case only came to light in 2008, when one of the basement children became seriously ill. Fritzl decided to take the child to a hospital. Medical staff quickly became suspicious. The child's condition and background did not align with the story Fritzl was telling. Authorities were contacted. Investigators began questioning him more closely. Eventually, Elizabeth was brought upstairs and interviewed by police. Once separated from her father and given reassurance that she was safe, she revealed the truth. The hidden basement was discovered. The children were rescued. The world reacted with disbelief. How could something like this happen in a modern European country? How could it continue for nearly a quarter of a century? The case dominated headlines across the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and beyond. It forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about control, manipulation, and how abuse can remain hidden even in seemingly normal communities. In 2009, Joseph Fritzl was convicted of murder, rape, incest, enslavement, and other charges. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The court ruled that he would remain in a secure psychiatric facility due to the severity of his crimes and the assessment of his mental state. One of the most painful parts of this case is thinking about the years that passed unnoticed. Elizabeth was declared missing. Her disappearance was explained away. The children who were raised upstairs grew up believing a false story about their origins. The ones in the basement grew up without sunlight, without school, or without a normal childhood. For many people, the idea that Fritzl's wife claimed to know nothing remains deeply unsettling. Some believe she must have suspected something. Others point out that abusers often maintain strict control and create believable lies. The basement was reportedly reinforced and locked in a way that made it difficult to access without knowing how. Investigators did not find evidence that she participated in the crimes, but public debate about her awareness continues. Cases like this challenge the way we think about safety. We tend to assume that extreme crimes happen in isolated or visibly chaotic environments, but this happened in a suburban home. Neighbors lived nearby, people walked past the house, children played in the yard. The psychological control Fritzl exerted over Elizabeth was also a major factor in how long the situation continued. Victims in long-term captivity often face not only physical barriers, but emotional manipulation. Fear, isolation, and dependency can become powerful tools in maintaining silence. When the case became public, there was global outrage, but there was also an outpouring of support for Elizabeth and her surviving children. Authorities took steps to protect their identities and give them medical and psychological care. They were relocated and given privacy so they could begin rebuilding their lives away from media attention. It is difficult to imagine the process of adjusting to freedom after spending so many years underground. Simple things like sunlight, open space, and interaction with other people would have been overwhelming. The children had to learn about the world from the beginning. This case remains one of the most disturbing examples of long-term captivity in modern history. It forces uncomfortable questions about how warning signs can be missed, how manipulation can silence victims, and how ordinary appearances can hide extraordinary cruelty. For audiences in Western countries, it also highlights the importance of vigilance and community awareness. It shows how institutions like hospitals, when attentive, can become the turning point that brings hidden abuse into the light. At its core, this story is not just about horror, it is about survival. Elizabeth endured 24 years of imprisonment and unimaginable trauma, yet she found the courage to speak when given the chance. Her testimony led to justice. Her resilience allowed her children to have a future outside those walls. The name Josef Fritzl became infamous worldwide, but the focus today remains on the strength of the victims rather than the crimes themselves. The case stands as a reminder that evil can hide behind ordinary facades, but it also shows that truth, even after decades, can emerge. It is one of those stories that stays with you because it feels almost impossible. Yet it happened in real life, in a real neighborhood, behind the doors of a house that looked like any other. In the mid-1980s, my mom became friends with a young man named George Waterfield Russell. At the time, he was just another person in her social circle. There was nothing about him that made anyone uneasy. He did not stand out as threatening or dangerous. According to my mom, he was quiet, polite, and a little shy when you first met him. But once he felt comfortable, he could be funny and even charming. He had an easy smile. He listened when people spoke. He seemed thoughtful. If you passed him on the street, you would never have guessed that he would one day be responsible for terrible violence. My mom described him as an average young man trying to figure out his life. He did not appear wild or reckless. He did not brag or draw attention to himself. In group settings, he often stayed toward the edge of conversations at first. But if someone spoke to him directly, he opened up. He could make clever remarks and sometimes told stories that made people laugh. There was nothing in his behavior that made her suspicious, nothing that hinted at what would later come out. During the late 1980s, their friendship was casual but real. They ran into each other through mutual friends. Sometimes they would talk at gatherings. Sometimes they would see each other in passing. He blended into everyday life the way most people do. That is part of what makes this story so difficult to process. It is easier to imagine evil looking different, sounding different, behaving in obvious ways. It is harder to accept that someone can appear kind and still hide something dark beneath the surface. In the summer of 1990, everything changed. News began to spread that George had been arrested. The charges were not minor. He was accused of murdering 3 young women. The shock rippled through the community. For those who knew him personally, including my mom, it felt unreal. She remembers hearing the news and thinking there had to be a mistake. The quiet, slightly awkward young man she knew did not match the image of a killer. As details emerged, disbelief turned into horror. George was charged and later found guilty of killing 3 women: Mary Ann Polreich, Carol Marie Bleeth, and Andrea Levine. These were not random names in a newspaper. They were real women with families, friends, and futures that were cut short. The crimes were not impulsive or quick. Reports revealed that he had subjected the women to prolonged violence. He used beatings, strangulation, and repeated stabbing to end their lives. The brutality shocked even seasoned investigators. This was not a single outburst of anger. It was deliberate and sustained. Each case carried its own timeline of suffering. For my mom, the hardest part was reconciling the 2 versions of the same person. The George she remembered was soft-spoken and reserved. The man described in court documents was capable of cruelty beyond imagination. She struggled with the idea that she had once stood in the same room, laughed at the same jokes, and trusted someone who had this capacity. The media gave him nicknames like the East Side Killer and the Charmer. Those names captured the unsettling contrast between his outward personality and his crimes. The word charmer suggests someone warm and likable. When paired with murder, it feels chilling. It highlights how easily appearances can mislead. The murders took place in Washington State, where the case drew intense local attention. Washington became the center of a community trying to understand how such violence could happen in familiar neighborhoods. People began looking at each other differently. Trust felt thinner. There is something deeply unsettling about learning that a serial killer was moving through ordinary spaces, apartment complexes, workplaces, social circles, without raising alarms. Court proceedings revealed more about how George operated. He targeted young women who trusted him enough to spend time with him. That betrayal of trust is one of the most painful aspects of the case. These women did not walk into dark alleys with strangers. They interacted with someone who seemed approachable and normal. That is what makes crimes like this especially frightening. They challenge the belief that danger is easy to recognize. When he was convicted, he received 2 life sentences plus an additional 28 years. The severity of the sentence reflected the seriousness of his actions. The court acknowledged that he had permanently taken 3 lives and devastated multiple families. For the loved ones of Mary Ann Polreich, Carol Marie Bleeth, and Andrea Levine, no sentence could undo what happened. But the conviction at least ensured that he would never walk free again. Over time, his name faded from national headlines. Unlike some serial killers whose cases became widely known across the country, George Waterfield Russell remained mostly a local memory. Outside of Washington, many people have never heard of him. In a way, that obscurity is strange. The crimes were brutal. The contrast between his personality and his actions was striking. Yet history does not treat all cases equally. Some become infamous, others remain known mainly within the communities they affected. For my mom, the story never fully faded. It stayed with her, not because she wanted attention or drama, but because it forced her to question her own judgment. She would replay conversations in her mind. Did he ever say anything unusual? Was there a moment she missed? A warning sign she failed to notice? In truth, there were none. That is part of what made it so disturbing. We like to believe that violent people reveal themselves through obvious red flags. Sometimes they do, but other times they appear completely ordinary. They hold jobs. They attend social gatherings. They laugh at jokes. They help carry groceries. That reality can be harder to accept than the violence itself. Hearing my mom talk about him was always complicated. There was sadness in her voice, not for him, but for the women who lost their lives and for the families left behind. There was also a quiet shock that someone she once considered harmless had caused so much suffering. She described him as someone who blended into the background. That ability to blend in may have been part of how he gained trust. The nickname the Charmer reflects how he presented himself. Charm can be disarming. It can lower defenses. When someone seems shy and gentle, people rarely suspect them of cruelty. That contrast makes the case deeply unsettling for many readers in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. It challenges the assumption that danger is loud or aggressive. The investigation revealed that his crimes were not spontaneous. They were carried out with intent. He had time to stop. He had time to reconsider. Instead, he continued. That pattern is what defines a serial killer. Multiple victims, separate incidents, and a repeated willingness to harm. When I think about the story, I often focus on the victims rather than the killer. Mary Ann Polreich, Carol Marie Bleeth, and Andrea Levine were young women with lives ahead of them. They had dreams, friendships, and families who loved them. Their names deserve to be remembered not only in connection with tragedy, but as individuals who mattered. It is easy for media coverage to focus heavily on perpetrators, their psychology, their methods, their courtroom appearances. But behind every headline are families who had to endure the unimaginable. Parents who buried daughters, friends who struggled with fear and grief, communities that felt shaken. My mom has said that the most difficult part was the sudden shift from normalcy to horror. One week, George was simply someone she knew. The next, he was on the evening news accused of murder. That kind of transformation feels abrupt. But in reality, the violence had been building in secret long before his arrest. The case also serves as a reminder that not all serial killers fit a single stereotype. Some are loud and reckless. Others are quiet and methodical. Some seek attention. Others avoid it. George did not appear to crave fame. After his conviction, he largely faded from public discussion. His obscurity does not lessen the severity of what he did, but it shows how public memory can be selective. For people reading about this case today, it raises uncomfortable questions. How well do we really know the people around us? What signs, if any, indicate deeper issues? The truth is that most people who appear normal are exactly that, normal. Cases like this are rare, but their rarity does not make them less shocking. In conversations about crime, there is often a temptation to look for simple explanations, a troubled childhood, a clear psychological disorder, a single traumatic event. While those factors can play a role, they rarely offer a complete answer. Human behavior is complex. Some individuals hide violent impulses behind a carefully managed exterior. When George was sentenced to life in prison, the legal chapter of the story closed. But for my mom, the emotional chapter never fully ended. She still occasionally reflects on those years in the mid-1980s, remembering casual conversations and ordinary gatherings. She does not speak of him with anger so much as with disbelief. It is strange to think that someone described as sweet and shy could be responsible for such harm. Yet history shows that appearances can be deceiving. The case of George Waterfield Russell stands as a reminder that evil does not always announce itself. In Washington, the memory of the murders still lingers for those who lived through that time. For others, it is a lesser-known chapter in the broader history of American crime. Whether remembered widely or not, the impact on the victims' families remains permanent. When my mom tells the story, she does not sensationalize it. She does not dwell on the violent details. Instead, She focuses on the shock of discovery and the lasting lesson about trust and perception. The experience changed how she views people, not by making her paranoid, but by reminding her that we can never fully know what someone carries inside. The story is unsettling because it feels close to home. It is not a distant headline from another country. It is a reminder that ordinary communities can hide extraordinary darkness. Yet it is also a reminder of resilience. The justice system worked. The victims' names are remembered, and those who survived the shock found ways to move forward. George Waterfield Russell may not be widely known outside of Washington, but for those connected to the case, his actions left a permanent mark. My mom's memories of him as a shy, charming young man exist alongside the reality of his crimes. The contrast between those two images is what makes the story so haunting. In the end, it is a story about trust, betrayal, and the fragile line between appearance and reality. It reminds us to honor the victims first and to approach stories like this not with fascination for the killer, but with empathy for those whose lives were stolen. When I was around 8 or 9 years old, there was a story that seemed to float through the hallways of our school like a rumor that refused to die. It didn't start with teachers or older students. It started with one of my classmates. He told it with confidence, like someone sharing a secret that made him important. Every recess, every lunch break, he would gather whoever was willing to listen and retell it. Each time, the details felt sharper, scarier, more dramatic. The story centered around his dad. According to him, his father worked in construction and had been assigned to demolish a very old, abandoned school building somewhere nearby. Even at that age, the idea of an abandoned school felt unsettling. Schools are supposed to be bright, noisy, and full of life. Imagining one sitting empty and forgotten already made it feel eerie. The way he described it made it worse. Broken windows, long, dusty hallways, old lockers hanging open, silence where there should have been laughter. He said his dad had to go into the building before demolition started. It was part of the job, he explained. They had to make sure there were no animals hiding inside. No stray dogs, raccoons, or anything that might be living in the structure before it was torn down. In our young minds, that sounded responsible, but also brave. Walking into a deserted building alone? That already felt like something out of a horror movie. Then came the part that made everyone lean in closer. He said his dad had been walking through the building, checking classrooms one by one. Doors creaked when open. Dust hung in the air. The light was dim. He came to a door he had already checked earlier that day. For some reason, he decided to open it again. When he did, a woman dressed completely in black, with pale skin and wild eyes, lunged at him. She had a shard of broken glass in her hand and tried to stab him with it. The way my friend described it, she appeared out of nowhere. 1 second, the room was empty. The next, she was charging toward his dad. We imagined long black hair covering her face, clothes torn and flowing like something from a ghost story. He said his dad barely had time to react, but somehow managed to grab her wrist, wrestle the glass away, and escape. According to the story, he ran out of the building and called the police. At that age, we didn't question much. We didn't ask how she got in there or why she was hiding. We just absorbed the image. A shadowy figure in an abandoned school waiting behind a door. It became one of those playground legends that felt real enough to make your stomach twist. For me, it stuck. I remember walking through our own school's hallways and thinking about empty classrooms. I would glance at doors differently. I started imagining what it would feel like to open one and find someone waiting behind it. The idea of being attacked when you least expect it got under my skin. It wasn't monsters under the bed anymore. It was something possible, something human. The story spread quickly. Kids from other classes heard about it. Some added their own details. The woman became taller. Her skin became even paler. In some versions, she screamed when she attacked. In others, she was silent. That's how stories grow among children. They become bigger, darker, and more dramatic with every retelling. Then came the last day of school that year. Parents were invited to attend a small end-of-year gathering. Classrooms were decorated. There were snacks, laughter, and the general chaos that comes with children excited about summer break. That day, my friend's dad showed up. It didn't take long before a group of us gathered around him. We were bold in a way only kids can be. We asked him directly if the story was true. Did it really happen? Was there really a woman hiding in that old school? He looked surprised at first. Then he laughed, but not in a dismissive way. More like someone realizing how far a story had traveled. He confirmed that something had happened, but not exactly the way we had been told. There had been a woman in the building, he said. She wasn't wearing all black. She wasn't pale and ghost-like. She was wearing a dirty, ripped t-shirt and looked disheveled, like someone who had been living rough. Instead of a shard of glass, she had a knife. He had opened a door, and she had been inside. Startled, she reacted aggressively. He managed to overpower her and get out safely. The police were called. That part was real. Hearing the real version didn't make it less frightening. In some ways, it made it more real. The dramatic details we had imagined, flowing black clothes, ghostly pale skin, were replaced with something more grounded. A real person, a real weapon, a real moment of danger. As a child, that truth unsettled me. It was no longer just a spooky image from a story. It was something that had actually happened to someone's dad. A regular adult, doing his job, opening a door in a place he thought was empty. The randomness of it is what stuck with me. He hadn't gone looking for trouble. He wasn't exploring for fun. He was just working. That thought stayed with me for years. Even now, I sometimes think about how quickly a situation can shift. One moment, you are moving through a space, comfortable and unaware. The next, you are face to face with danger. That idea frightened me more than any exaggerated detail ever could. Looking back, I can see how the story reflected something deeper about childhood fears. At that age, we are just starting to understand that the world is not always safe. We begin to realize that adults don't have total control over everything. Hearing that a grown man could be surprised and attacked in a place he thought was empty shook that sense of certainty. It also changed how I saw abandoned places. Old buildings stopped feeling just mysterious and started feeling unpredictable. Even now, if I walk into an unfamiliar space, I sometimes remember that story. I check corners. I notice doors. It's not paranoia. It's awareness. As an adult, I also understand something else about the woman in that building. She likely wasn't some villain hiding for fun. She may have been homeless. She may have been mentally unwell. She may have been scared herself. If someone suddenly opened the door to the room you were hiding in, you might react out of panic too. That perspective didn't exist for me when I was 8. But back then, it wasn't about context. It was about the image, a door opening, a sudden lunge, a weapon flashing in someone's hand. It was the idea that danger could be silent and hidden until the exact moment you stumbled upon it. The fact that the story was sort of true made it linger longer than most playground tales. It wasn't entirely made up. It had roots in reality. That blurred line between exaggeration and truth made it powerful. It taught me early on how stories can grow, how details can shift, how fear can be amplified through repetition. Even now, I remember standing in that classroom on the last day of school, looking up at my friend's dad as he calmly corrected the story. There was something grounding about hearing it from him. He wasn't dramatic. He didn't seem shaken. He treated it like an unfortunate event that he handled and moved past. For us kids, though, it became a lesson in unpredictability. It was one of the first times I realized that the world contains moments you cannot fully prepare for. That realization is uncomfortable, especially for a child. Over time, the fear faded. The story became less about being attacked and more about how stories spread and evolved. It became a memory of sitting cross-legged on a playground, listening wide-eyed while someone described something terrifying. It became a reminder of how our imaginations can take a real event and turn it into something almost cinematic. Still, there is a small part of me that remembers that feeling of unease. The thought of opening a door and not knowing what's on the other side. It's a simple idea, but it captures something universal. We all walk through life assuming the next room will be ordinary. Most of the time it is, but sometimes it isn't. That childhood story taught me something about awareness, about how quickly reality can interrupt routine. It also showed me how fear can grow in the gaps between truth and imagination. And even though it scared me back then, it's now just another piece of growing up, a reminder of how we first begin to understand that the world is both ordinary and unpredictable at the same time.